Okay, thank you, everybody. Welcome to this press conference and briefing on U.S. sanctions on Afghanistan Central Bank, their impact on the Afghan economy, and on the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. As many of you know, the United Nations has said that Afghanistan is in a downward humanitarian spiral, with up to half the population at risk of severe food insecurity and potentially starvation, and has also said that these sanctions on Afghanistan's central bank are a major contributor to the crisis there. My name is Marcus Stanley. I will be moderating this discussion. I'm the Advocacy Director for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We have four speakers with us today in order of their speaking. Masuda Sultan is a co-founder of the U.S. group Unfreeze Afghanistan, a longtime Afghan American women's rights activist, and entrepreneur. In 2008, she became an advisor to the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan, a co-founder of Women for Afghan Women, and she recently was part of a delegation to Afghanistan to examine conditions under the current Taliban government. Kelly Campbell is the co-founder of the September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, and also traveled to Afghanistan on this delegation with other 9/11 family members. She is the co-chair of the group's Afghanistan committee, which is focused on unfreezing these Afghan Central Bank funds and returning them to the Afghan people. Dr. Shah Marabi is a board member of the Afghanistan Central Bank and an economics professor at Montgomery College in Maryland. He has served as a senior economic advisor to two former ministers of finance of Afghanistan. He has authored numerous articles on economics and business and been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg. John Sifton is the Asia Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch. His work focuses on South and Southeast Asia and terrorism and counterterrorism worldwide. He previously founded a public interest investigation firm, One World Research, and worked for the International Rescue Committee in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So each speaker will give a brief 5-minute overview of their perspective on these issues, and then we will open it up to questions, which you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your window to input questions. Okay, so Masuda, would you like to begin?
Sure, thank you, Marcus and Quincy Institute for hosting this with Unfreeze. With the catastrophic economic situation the Afghan people are coping with, it is unconscionable for the US to withhold $7 billion that is desperately needed to provide currency reserves and liquidity for the Afghan banking system. The money can be returned to the central bank in tranches with safeguards and monitoring to ensure funds are used for the intended purpose of conducting basic central bank functions. This should begin immediately. Unfreeze Afghanistan is a group of American women advocates with decades of experience in Afghanistan. We recently filed an amicus brief in the 9/11 lawsuit to share our research, including the findings from our recent trip to Afghanistan last month. We felt compelled to submit the brief because of what we saw and learned about what happens to a country when it cannot perform basic central bank functions, especially a country that is severely impoverished. We at Unfreeze had originally come together as a group of women who were trying to get teacher salaries paid after the collapse of the government, having been concerned for them for two reasons. One, we were concerned about the future of education, especially girls' education, as the Taliban were taking over. Two, teachers comprise the largest block of women employed in the country. As Afghanistan's aid withdrew with the troops 75% of the government's budget and all of the programs off budget, including support for education and health development projects, we wondered what would happen to these women, their unpaid salaries, their jobs, and their future. I visited Afghanistan with Kelly, who will be speaking later, and 6 other women early last month, and was struck by the sheer desperation and depression of the population. 95% of people don't have enough to eat. Almost half the population lives on less than 1 meal a day. And 9 million people are at risk of famine-like conditions. We met many women and men who were just devastated about having lost income and not being able to support their families. It's estimated that around 900,000 people have lost their jobs since the collapse. We met people who were having trouble accessing food distribution sites, who had only had a piece of bread the day before. We saw that food was available in the market, but people just couldn't afford it. I had an old man collapse crying in my arms from having not eaten and having stomach pains. The compounded effects of the collapse of the government and aid leaving, the worst drought in decades, COVID, and on top of it, having their central bank funds seized means that banking is crippled and the economy is spiraling down faster than we can really track. We understand there's been a 40% drop in GDP, which is like the Great Depression, only much, much faster. Christiana Mampour, who just reported from Kabul yesterday, said it best. Everyone is hurting. We know that the UN appeal of 4.4 billion is only half funded, and we need to increase humanitarian aid. But does it make sense to withhold $7 billion of central bank funds and continue asking for aid money? We know taxpayers don't want to pay aid forever. Some will say we have to withhold these funds until Taliban fulfill commitments on women's rights. I, as a women's rights activist, ask, how are we helping women by withholding their money? In fact, they are being punished. We met businesswomen at the Afghan Women's Chamber of Commerce who had lost most of their employees and who couldn't pay the ones remaining due to the banking issues. And while we urged the Taliban to reopen girls' schools, high schools as fast as possible, we can't justify holding someone's money because they can't go to school. In fact, when we asked one woman if her girls were going to school, she said, "What school? Even my boys don't go. I can't afford the paper and pens for them." By withholding these funds, the suffering of an entire nation is exacerbated. There are a lot of misconceptions about the central bank funds and their intended uses. This is not the Taliban's money, not to be used as their expense fund, and it's not for humanitarian support to feed people. This is something even the Taliban have acknowledged and understand. This is something I hope today you will understand why having the central bank with its funds back matters so much to Afghan women and girls and families who are hoping to overcome the collective punishment being inflicted on them after a long 20-year war, and that it can be done responsibly if only one listens to the experts, including Dr. Marabi and others here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. That was really powerful. I'm sorry. Thank you, Masuda. That was very powerful. Kelly?
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Masuda. I like getting confused with Masuda. That feels like an honor. My name is Kelly Campbell. I am one of the many co-founders of September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. We're all people who lost loved ones on September 11th and have come together to turn our grief into action for peace and justice. I did travel with other members of 9/11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows to Afghanistan in January of 2002 because we were concerned at that time about what was happening to ordinary Afghans. We were concerned that US bombs were hitting ordinary Afghans' homes, and in fact they were. We learned at that time that it was just regular Afghans that, just like our families, were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we met at that time with families who lost their homes to US bombs. We met with children in the hospitals missing limbs from US cluster bombs, and we came back to work with Masuda and others to advocate for an Afghan Victims Fund and to raise up the issue of Afghan civilian casualties. And so for the past 20 years, we've worked for peace and for justice in Afghanistan and around the world in the names of our loved ones. And to say, war in our names does not make sense. And so when Afghanistan, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan last August, we also became concerned about what was going to happen to the Afghan people at that time. And then learning that the $7 billion in the Afghan Central Bank funds were being frozen, and that money was potentially being attached to a lawsuit by a small number of 9/11 family members known as the Havlish Fund, we became really concerned and interested to see what we could potentially do to ensure that the $7 billion of Afghan Central Bank funds could be returned to the Afghan people to whom the money belongs. And so although I'm not a lawyer and I'm certainly not a banker, many of us started learning a lot about the law and started learning a lot about banking and tried to figure out what we could do as 9/11 family members who care very deeply about the ordinary people of Afghanistan to see what we could potentially do to help make sure that they get their money rightfully returned to them, particularly when they're in such dire situation as Masuda outlined in terms of their economy. So members of our organization started speaking out. My husband was quoted in the New York Times in February talking about how this money really belongs to Afghan people. And members of our organization wrote a op-ed that was published in the New York Daily News. We had people on the Mehdi Hassan show. We were quoted in The Intercept and in other outlets. And as a result, the organization started growing really for the first time in many years. A lot of new members started joining, people who were just children when their parents were killed on September 11th, have started joining the organization over this issue because there are so many 9/11 family members who actually believe it's just wrong for 9/11 family members to try to take this money. And so it's an interesting situation that we filed an amicus brief in this case, and it's the only amicus brief that was thrown out by the judge. So that in this case, we're very glad that Unfreeze and several other amicus briefs by other Afghan diaspora groups and Afghans were allowed to be heard in the case that make similar arguments, similar legal arguments that ours made in terms of why this money simply doesn't belong to the Taliban. So we're glad to see that those were allowed. Unfortunately, the one that we submitted that was authored by 9/11 family members isn't allowed, which puts us in this weird situation where the only 9/11 family member voice that's allowed in the case is that of 9/11 family members wanting to take money from starving Afghans. The other interesting piece about that is that no one signed up to take money from starving Afghans. A lot of the lawsuits that are now attached to this Havlish lawsuit of 9/11 family members, most people got involved because they wanted to sue Saudi Arabia for discovery of what the Saudi government might have had to do with 9/11. And so these lawsuits are all conjoined now with the Havlish lawsuit, all happening rather quickly, and from the people that I've talked to who are plaintiffs in these lawsuits, without many of the plaintiffs really knowing or understanding what's going on. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs. What from the research that I've done and that folks in our organization have done, it's very clear that legally this money doesn't belong to the Taliban. It belongs to the people of Afghanistan. And that the central bank, as I think we'll hear more from Dr. Merhavi and from John, the central bank really has a particular function. This isn't Taliban slush fund money. This isn't just money that could be used for whatever the Taliban decides to use it for. It's a central bank, and that functions very differently than perhaps other parts of a government that may be controlled by the Taliban, and it has particular rules around it that are controlled by international banking systems. And so there really are ways that this money could be released and should be released to benefit the Afghan people and to get their economy going again. As Masuda said, from what we saw there, the economy really is in collapse. And it's absolutely immoral and unconscionable for us in the US to continue holding this money. And it's absolutely disgusting that this money would be held for this lawsuit, which all the lawyers we've spoken to, including people within the White House and within the State Department, believe this lawsuit has no merit and it should be thrown out. And so we're hoping that that will be the case and that this money can get back to Afghan people as soon as possible. So I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marabi.
You're muted, Dr.
You're on mute, Dr. Marabi. You should unmute yourself.
Good morning. I'm sorry. It's easily happens. But anyway, I want to welcome all of you here, and also I want to thank Quincy Institute and obviously my colleague and friend Masuda for organizing this session. I think want to acknowledge the effort of many different entities who have worked very hard in the last 9 months at about 40 organizations. It would be hard to name all of them, but I think my close association, not only with Unfreeze, but also I think United Against Inhumanity, as well as my colleague Ariana and overseas in Europe, who all have worked extensively in trying to address the issue of unfreezing Afghan assets are noteworthy. And hopefully we will get some policy changes and as the months proceed. What I would like to do in the limited time that we have, and we can address a lot of issues on the questions, is to give you an idea of what the Central Bank of Afghanistan is, and also to along the line how it operates, and also what does the independence of central bank means. I think it's very important to keep that in mind, and then to address the issue of how has the unfreezing of assets has affected the economy of Afghanistan. I think that is an area, and then later on, why is it a holdup? It's been 9 months that I've been working on, and I was one of the first person actually brought up this issue back in September 1st. And when I talked with Reuter and wrote my op-ed, and since 9 months, there have been some progress, but not to the point of total release of the funds to be given to that is the Afghanistan Central Bank, which rightfully belongs to that particular entity. But first thing, I think there's misconception in the mind of many people. In the two areas of misconception exists. One is that what is central bank and how is it independent? And the other misconception is that Americans believe that these reserves are theirs. That is that this is taxpayers' money, therefore we can do whatever we want. And obviously, president has a lot of leeways as to what the president, based on the Constitution, has given him a lot of powers to do what at least is in the best interest of the United States. We can address that later, but Central Bank of Afghanistan, I think it's very important to keep in mind, this was established as an independent entity and with full autonomy to do what? To carry its goal and objectives and responsibilities. And an important point is, it is clearly without interference and without any pressure by any particular entity, governmental entity or otherwise. I think this is an important point to be brought up here. Is now when I talked about the primary objective of the central bank, and this is very similar to the central bank of other countries, is to track and manage the money supply. And to track and manage the money supply is for the purpose of bringing about and maintaining price stability. And Masuda talked about people could not afford to buy basic bread. And there were big lines of people forming in the bakery store trying to be able to have access to a piece of bread. So the main objective of the central bank is to be able to bring stable prices, which affects the poor people, the women, the children who cannot afford to buy because the prices have skyrocketed. So it is very important to understand that, and also to be able to foster liquidity. Now, the central bank also does other functions, regulating the financial institution, supervising financial institution, and also providing a lot of payment services to other financial institutions. All of that has been hampered as a result of not having access to the reserve that the central bank has accumulated over the last 20 years. I think it is, when you look at central bank, if they cannot form its function, it affects who? It affects the public at large. And that is why you see a high degree of poverty that is prevailing. That is why you see a close to collapse of the economy overall in not allowing central bank to have not only access to its foreign exchange reserve, but also not having access to Afghani banknotes that are printed in Poland, for example, that are still pending and has not been delivered to the Central Bank of Afghanistan. So all of these are bringing about hardship on Afghan people. More specifically, when you look at it in the areas where hardship has come about, I think these are all backed up by data I had predicted, and this is a matter of fact, can be verified. What I predicted, what has occurred in the economy overall. I predicted there would be double-digit inflation. We have a double-digit inflation. I predicted that the foreign exchange of Afghani versus US dollar would be in double-digit. That has occurred. It is double-digit. I also predicted, obviously, that the businesses would not be able to have enough and adequate, obviously, reserve to be able to pay for import, and the trade balance would deteriorate. That has happened. So if you look at all the data with regard to depreciation, with regard to inflation rate, with regard to trade, all data shows that indeed there's a great deterioration. There's a 20% fall in the budget also on the fiscal side. So when you look at these, all these particular indicators, all the statistics, there's a decline in imports. Why? People, the merchants do not have access to the fund to bring about import so that it will affect our prices and stabilize and bring some degree of stability in the prices. So you're looking at conditions that could be easily remedied by allowing Central Bank of Afghanistan to have access to these funds. Now, these funds clearly are designed to be used for the purpose that I mentioned. That is, price stability. It's very important that you're eliminating or reducing the volatility in exchange rate. It is not designed for the purpose of entertaining humanitarian aid. Now, humanitarian aid, I argued back 9 months ago, is a short gap measure. It does not address the demand side of the economy, which have to be addressed significantly and expeditiously. The humanitarian aid is understandable. It is needed. I'm not saying that it should continue, but it should not be looked at as a solution for rekindling the economy. The foreign exchange reserve of Afghanistan are precious resources of Afghanistan. These are our national resources. It has given us a cushion to use and manage our banking system volatility, to be able to go ahead and allow people to have access to lower prices, to be able to afford to buy the basic necessities of life, food, paying for cooking oil, paying for fuel, sugar, and other basic necessities. So when you look at the availability of these total reserve for these purposes that I mentioned, it is very critical, because that will move us toward bringing about stabilization of the economy and also our private sector, which we have worked very hard over the 20 years to go ahead and establish and provide a lot of significant aid in that particular area. So when you look at it, there are a lot of obviously these challenges, but these challenges can easily be addressed by policymakers. And we have put a lot of effort, at least in the Congress in the last 9 months, to get the President Biden to address this issue. In the unfortunate decision of splitting dues that we can address at the time of questions and answer would be an important one that Kelly talked about in the impact of that splitting the 3.5 in a way that at least deprives Afghans for the necessary fund that needs to be given to them to be able to address the near collapse of the economy. So I will stop here and entertain any question later on. And I hope I stayed with the time framework, Marcus.
Thank you. Close enough, and you had a lot of important things to say. So we're going to go to John for the conclusion and then open it up to questions. And I see some people have already been putting questions in the Q&A. And when you do put questions in, please say what your organization is and where you are from. So then I can say that when reading the question. Okay, thanks. John?
Thank you very much. My name again is John Sifton. I'm with Human Rights Watch, and I merely want to expand slightly on some of the points that Dr. Mahrabi made about the misperceptions about the sanctions, about the foreign currency reserves, and about the status of the central bank, because I feel that these misperceptions are fueling some of the bad policy or misunderstandings that are fueling the bad decisions by donor countries, including the United States. So first of all, I mean, look, there's so much focus on the foreign currency reserves. We really should broaden the conversation out and talk about the Afghan economy itself and how it too, not just these foreign currency reserves, but the economy in the abstract has been frozen. It's been frozen because it's been cut off from the international financial system, the banking systems that move electronic dollars and other currencies through the world from one central bank to another, from one private bank to another. Afghanistan is not some magical self-sustaining country or self-supporting country that has its own resources that it can use to feed its own people, because no country is self-sufficient in the world, really. Every country requires an interlinked, some level of interlinkedness with other countries' economies. In the case of Afghanistan, for instance, the economy requires the purchase of food and other supplies from other countries. That requires money being paid to people in other countries so that things can be purchased for import into Afghanistan. Where is that money going to come from? When you hear the economic term, a country having a negative balance payments, negative balance of payments, that it essentially means that. It means that a country spends more purchasing imports than it makes on exporting and its other sources of revenue. And that's normal. A lot of countries are like that in the world, including the United States. It's normal. My point is, because Afghanistan is a normal country in this regard, it can't be cut off from the international banking system without there being serious impacts on the economy. And that means the price of food, the capacity of people to purchase it, and everything. There are multiple causes for what's going on right now. Because of the restrictions, we're seeing increases in transaction costs for imports. We're seeing food already rising with inflation because food prices are rising all over the world with inflation. But that's even worse because of the currency devaluation in Afghanistan, because of transactional costs going up. So at the very moment that people have suddenly had their incomes cut off, they're also facing higher prices. So it's like a 1-2 punch. All this to just buttress and second what Dr. Mahrabi said. An economy requires a banking system. And what's gone on here is not just the cutoff of the foreign currency reserves, which are required to stabilize the economy in the way Dr. Mahrabi said, but also just the capacity to engage in transactions. And by the way, that also includes not just commercial transactions, but humanitarian operations, which need to fly money into the country. Remittances, Afghans and others sending money to Afghans in Afghanistan through Western Union and other banking systems. So now, just really quickly, this is what I was going to focus on. There are a lot of misunderstandings about why the banking system is cut off, and people assume that it's all about sanctions. Well, it is to some degree about sanctions, but there are no sanctions on Afghanistan. There are no sanctions on the Afghan government. There are sanctions on the Taliban and its leadership and several of its individual members. And because of those sanctions, a lot of governments, including the US, have made the decision to revoke the credentials of the Afghan Central Bank to engage in transactions with the international banking system, the World Bank, and access its money at the Federal Reserve. Many people think the sanctions somehow froze the foreign currency reserves. in New York after August 15th when the Taliban collapsed. That's not the case. All that happened in August 2021 was that the Federal Reserve and the World Bank told the central bank, you no longer have access to your currency, your money. The same as if I was Citibank and I took away your credit card and your ID and said, you can't access your money anymore. That's what happened. Subsequently, the money was frozen February 2022. It was frozen by the Biden administration. Half was put aside in an account supposedly to satisfy compensation for the 9/11 victims. The other half was put back into an account for the Central Bank of Afghanistan and is right here in New York at the Federal Reserve in their name. Could be transferred right now, this very hour, if the central bank had its credentials. So when we talk about the freezing, what we're really talking about is the bank not having its credentials. But it's not just that money, it's also their capacity to use Citibank and others to move money, to purchase imports, to purchase banknotes and bring them into the country and auction to stabilize their currency. All of that is on hold because they don't have their credentials. The other misunderstanding I want to say is about the lawsuit. A lot of people think that the Biden administration is somehow trying to get this $3.5 billion to the 9/11 families. But if you actually look at their filings in the federal court here, they make all the points in that lawsuit, in their filing, about why the 9/11 plaintiffs who deserve compensation from the people who carried out 9/11 are not actually entitled to this money. It doesn't belong to them. Central bank assets can't be used to satisfy judgments, and all these reasons, which I think the judge will find quite compelling. And that's what's so tragic and frustrating about the Biden administration's decision. The Justice Department knows that the case law is against the 9/11 families, and yet they set aside this money apparently for domestic media consumption. And that's very, very frustrating. The last thing I wanted to point out was that we can't just blame the United States and other donor countries and the World Bank for this situation. They deserve blame. But some of the demands they're making of the Taliban vis-a-vis the leadership of the central bank are not completely crazy. They're about anti-money laundering measures and about legal issues that are just like non-starter legal issues because of the UN sanctions being what they are. The Taliban has plenty of reason to complain about those complaints. But if the Taliban is completely recalcitrant and completely stubborn and insists that they can do whatever they want with the central bank leadership, then they're not going to ever get access to these credentials. This is a negotiation, and I'm just telling it like it is. I'm not justifying the US position. I'm just stating as a matter of geopolitical fact that the Taliban needs to understand that central banks often do have to agree to monitoring and auditing from outside actors. Ask any country that's defaulted on its debt, from Argentina to Greece, how much central banks have to agree to terms set by others. It's hegemonic, it's unfortunate, but it's reality. And I just want to make clear that the Taliban too bear responsibility for not being as flexible as they might otherwise be on all these issues. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, John. And we have a bunch of questions and comments. And anyone who wants to add questions, please add in the Q&A. We should be able to get to all of these. I just wanted to kick it off with one question to Dr. Merabi based on what John just said. Do you think that there is a chance that the Taliban will agree to governance requirements on the central bank, and what kinds of governance requirements, in your view, make sense?
The central bank is governed by central bank law, or it's called DAB law. The DAB law is intact since they have taken power. The DAB law has not changed. Now, if DAB law would have changed, I would have argued that there's room for being able to change the governance structure. The governance structure is spelled out clearly in DAB law. So if one was to argue, I think John mentioned the MLCFT the AML-CFT department, that is anti-money laundering department, is still active. And the people who, at least the director had at least departed Afghanistan, but the deputy director is there. And I think that area that is of concern to the United States, and when I talk with the Treasury, I think could possibly be in an area that they could do some degree of training, retraining of others who have left. I think that's a legitimate point, and I don't think the governing body, which is the Supreme Council, would object to that. I think that could be done. There are other areas of trying to come up with a parallel institution to central bank is totally does not make sense. You're duplicating another an impossibility to be able to duplicate the 20 years of investment and to ask a commercial bank to go ahead and spearhead the responsibility of central bank. That is not going to be able to occur. Now that and to be able to, as some have argued, that a commercial bank, and then a specific commercial bank, to be in one way or another authorized to carry out these activities is nothing less than dismantling central bank. And I think that is, we should avoid doing that. Now, in the area of other, beside AML CFT, I have asked the Treasury as to tell me exactly what are other areas beside AML CFT that needs to be addressed, so that we could have some degree of agreement and get a central bank moving again and try to perform its duties and responsibilities. And they have not come forward with regard to any of the inquiries that I have had, with the exception of agreeing that the AML CFT would be an area that they will focus on.
Thank you. Okay, and I know we have seen some of these proposals in the US to somehow route around the central bank with these money and reserves. And I know that wasn't at all what John was talking about. And that's a non-starter. It really doesn't work. Okay, so first question from the audience here, from Samid Guha. I think for Kelly or Masuda, if you know a lot about the lawsuit, do you have a sense as to whether this litigation, as it impacts the Afghan funds, is driven by the plaintiff's lawyers or by the families? What portion of the $3.5 billion would go to plaintiff's lawyers if awarded?
I don't know if I can answer that directly, but I will say, the original lawsuit is called the Havlish suit. It's brought by about 150 people who are related to 47 victims of September 11th. So it's pretty small, right? There were almost 3,000 victims. This is people who are related to 47 of them. And the lead lawyer on that lawsuit now is Lee Wolowski. You can read, The Intercept did a great piece on Lee Wolowski. He worked for the Biden administration on Afghanistan policy. And then he left the Biden administration, and a month later, he was the lead lawyer for the Havlish plaintiffs. And he claims that he had recused himself from anything to do with the central bank funds while he was working for the Biden administration. But it feels a little too close to home for me that he was involved at that level and then over here. So, I don't know the percentage, but I think that these lawyers who are involved in these cases stand to make quite a bit of money. And that's why they're taking these big cases. I know that a lot of folks had trouble finding lawyers to work pro bono on amicus briefs, partially because a lot of these big law firms were involved as lawyers working for various 9/11 family cases on this. So, all I can say is that of all the 9/11 families that I've talked to, there's nobody who signed up to take money from starving Afghans. There are a lot of people who are plaintiffs who never intended to be plaintiffs against Afghanistan in any way, and are really frustrated by this, and are trying to figure out, what their options are. But as John said, we really don't think this case has merit, and really do think it's going to get thrown out. So, hopefully that can happen sooner than later.
And Kelly, while we have you, another question from Kia Barzagan. Did the judge give any reason why your amicus brief was thrown out? Because that seems outrageous, honestly.
Yeah, it comes back to this guy, Lee Wolowski again. So if there's any other reporters on here who want to do some more investigation, he pointed out very helpfully that there are members of our organization who are plaintiffs in various, nobody is a Havlish plaintiff, but there are plaintiffs in other 9/11 cases that are now connected to Havlish. And we've never hidden that. That is true. And so that there would be some conflict of interest because by definition, to be amici, you couldn't have standing. So some of our members have standing because they're plaintiffs, so they can't also be amici. However, they're not actually being represented by their lawyers because they don't actually believe that they should be plaintiffs. So so we were thrown out. And so what happened is actually one of our members who is not a plaintiff, has no family members who are plaintiffs at all, then tried to file with a similar argument, but very clearly stating, that she was filing on her own. That was also thrown out because she is a member of our organization, even though she stated in it, I am a member of this organization. So again, the only voice of 9/11 family members that's being allowed at all in this lawsuit is the voice of family members trying to take the money, even though that we don't believe that's very widely representative. Our organization alone has around 275 active members. So, we know that there's a fair percentage of folks that are actively opposed to this litigation. And there's probably a lot more out there that are, don't even know what's going on.
Wow, thank you. So we have several questions on money that's frozen at European banks, who I guess from what John was saying, this cutting off the credentials also cuts off Afghanistan from the European banking system. So Jean-Francois Cotin and Antonio Donini both asked about this. A couple questions. Are any of you working on this issue of frozen funds in Europe and at European banks? Could these frozen funds in European banks be released independently from the U.S.? And I guess this is mainly in Germany. And are these European banks just going to take their cue from the U.S., or are they going to independently decide and potentially independently release their funds? John, you want to take that?
Dr. Malrabi can go first.
Well, thank you, John. What I think is we have 2.1 billion. Not all of 2.1 billion are in Europe, but most of it is in Europe. But the majority of it is in Commerzbank and Deutsche Bank in Germany, and then we have a small amount in Bank of Italy and also Bank of England and Ireland. So we have what our colleagues in Europe, and Antonio is one of them, I brought this issue up that we need to contact those particular entities to release the fund to debt. We have not succeeded in that. What I'm going to recommend to the Treasury, and that to be able to at least issue an OFAC or some letter of comfort, so that they will be in a position to independently, they will not act independently unless they get a blessing from Treasury to be able to release those funds to debt. If that does not materialize, the second course of action is to get Treasury to agree that a part of that fund, if it's not from the 3.5 billion that is set aside for what is called quote unquote to help benefit Afghan people, as was stated by President Biden, to if either a part of that 3.5 or a part of 2.1 billion to be set aside to litigate the case or have legal representation in the courts by DAP. And that has been hampered to a great extent because DAP, lack of resources by DAP, has prevented DAP to be able to have legal representation. The DAPs needs to be able to defend and will defend, and they've argued it will defend those particular assets as they rightfully belongs to DAP. And legal representation is costly phenomena, and a lot of times it cannot be done on pro bono basis. and therefore we would request either part of 2.1 or part of the 3.5 billion be set aside to hire a law firm to litigate this case in Libya.
John, you want to?
Yeah, so a couple things to add on, and I also want to start taking a stab at a question by Moshe and Amin about some of the correspondent banking accounts, because it's linked. Let's just pretend, or let's just assume for the sake of argument, that the Federal Reserve funds in New York remain off limits because the United States government does not recognize the credentials of the Central Bank of Afghanistan. Okay, and that's the situation such as it is. But let's say, for the sake of argument, some other country did recognize the credentials and had in their central bank foreign currency reserves. How would the Central Bank of Afghanistan access that money if they don't have access to the international banking system and their capacity to use a foreign account at, say, I don't know, United Overseas Bank of Singapore or Deutsche Bank or Citibank? How would they move it in any currency given the lack of credentials that the Treasury Department has set? I mean, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but the fact of the matter is the United States exercises an almost complete hegemonic control over the international banking system. And even if you have, assets in euros or British pounds or Swiss francs, it's extraordinarily difficult to move that money unless the Treasury Department has essentially given you specific permission, not just a general license, which is like a permission slip in the abstract, but what's called a specific license that's directed specifically to a specific bank that says you can do X, you can do this. If the Treasury Department were to say to a foreign bank, to Citibank, for instance, you can transfer the assets of the central bank in England, Bank of England, to a Qatari bank or an Emirati bank, and they can then use those assets, transfer them into dollars, and do central bank things like purchase banknotes and hold an auction in Kabul, fly the money in and hold auctions, or use it to settle as the collateral to settle some transactions between private banks in Afghanistan and private banks in Pakistan or Kazakhstan or wherever money needs to go. You could do that, but it would be extremely restrictive. And that's the problem we have right now with correspondent of banks. There's so much over compliance, as they call it, where banks won't do something unless they are specifically told that it is allowed, that even when things are allowed, banks don't let them happen because they're so scared they're going to get in trouble. So that's one thing. And then on the Afghani banknotes, Afghanis, like the money, there are banknotes printed already. There are banknotes that could be printed in the future. There is a kind of alchemy for them coming into existence. It's a very tightly regulated set of standards in the international banking system about how money comes into existence and how it can be recognized as on foreign currency exchange. The reason the companies that would be involved in the printing and the shipping of Afghani banknotes are reluctant to do so is because they have nobody to interact with because of the credentialing issues I've been talking about. Who do they interact with? They need to interact with the central bank, but the central bank doesn't have its credentials on the international banking system, so it's literally impossible. I mean, could somebody fly in and present credentials and the European Union would recognize them, or the government of Poland would recognize them? Yeah, technically, but those things would have to happen. And then last on the thing about the executive order, State and Treasury, it's not so much that they came up with a plan to use the 3.5, they just put the 3.5 for the benefit of the Afghan people. A lot of people thought it was put into a trust fund or some kind of designated thing that could only be used for this. That's actually not true. That was just the press release. The actual specific license that Treasury Department gave to the New York Federal Reserve says that the money should be just deposited into an account in the name of the central bank, and it can be withdrawn by any accredited representative of the central bank. It could happen today, and it doesn't have to be for any particular purpose. So again, this is all about credentials. I'm just saying it again. It's really all about credentials.
Yeah. So I see that we have only a couple minutes and a couple more questions to get to, but I see that Kelly and Dr. Marabi wanted to add something here on the correspondent banking issues. If you could do that quickly.
Yeah, just real quickly, I just wanted to share that when I asked this question to the White House recently about the money that is in the European banks, they said that it's actually the challenge there, they said to me, was that the central bank money that's in the European banks is even more difficult to get released because those banks are waiting until the Taliban is the recognized government of Afghanistan until it can be released. That is what I was told.
Okay, Dr. Marabi.
Yeah, I think that John brought up an important point that there has to be an alternative to corresponding bank established for Afghanistan. We had the Citibank, who served as a correspondent bank, is no longer interested in that. When I talk with the Treasury, they tell me that they cannot force commercial banks, which I can take an issue with that. But alternative to Citibank, there are many other entities that exist that at least, and they get a blessing again or approval from Treasury, they will not serve as a corresponding bank. There is obviously Crown Agent Bank of United Kingdom, still is in Afghanistan. That could be actually encouraged to serve as a corresponding bank, or JP Morgan Chase, or we could get Wells Fargo, or we could get some United Arab Emirates Islamic Bank there, or other entities that could serve as a correspondent bank. But it's very critical to have a correspondent bank. I tell you what the obstacle exists here. DAB has had a contract with a Polish printing company. Now, in that particular contract, the remaining Afghanis, which is 3 billion Afghanis, should have been delivered back in September of 2021. It has not been delivered yet. What is that problem? They're twofold. One is there's no corresponding that would accept the remaining amount of the contract money to be delivered to Polish printing company. It was delivered and was rejected because the international banking would not accept funds from Central Bank of Afghanistan. So the amount that is remaining, I brought this with the Treasury, there has to be facilitation made to be able to deliver the last payment based on the contract to a Polish company, so the Polish company would release these Afghani banknotes that are needed in Afghanistan. And then also the issue of logistics as to who's going to deliver those particular funds. So definitely corresponding bank is the utmost needed issue that needs to be addressed quickly. The other point that I think John brought up is very important also is that it is correct that this money, the 3.5, is Afghans' money, and it's managed by them. The money still cannot be accessed by anybody else except Afghans. So based on United States law, and John is a lawyer in this case, there's a great deal of discussion that is going on 25B program. We have made quite a bit of progress in how this transactional process is going to be finalized. And I think we have made quite a bit of progress, and that will be, I think, to media, we will release that final decision fairly quickly as to who is going to act as an executor of that particular fund. And then the second step is that it will have to go, as my argument has been, totally for DAB, to DAB, and be used mostly for auction purposes, and possibly to relieve the debt issue as well, but not for the government coffers or for the payment of the salary or humanitarian purpose.
Great. There was another question I wanted to be sure to get to from Nora Nyland. And there, by the way, also someone asked if the email addresses of the speakers would be available, and they are. I will drop my own email address into the or into the chat here so people can contact me. And I'll make sure to pass along any further thoughts or contact requests people have. But Nora Nyland is from, sorry, let me call up your, is joining us from United Against Inhumanity, which is working on this same issue and has a website, www.against-inhumanity.org. So anyone who wants to pursue these issues with them can do so. But Nora asked what I think is a very important question, which is what is the legal basis for blocking these credentials? Is there any reasonable or even legal justification for doing this, or is it just arbitrary? John, did you want to take that on first?
Yeah, it's not arbitrary in the first instance. So in the chaos of the collapse of the former government, it actually makes a certain amount of sense to tell the Federal Reserve to put a hold on transactions. Same thing happened when the Burmese junta, the Burmese military took control in Myanmar. They immediately put a freeze on this. Now, the reason they did that with Burma is because the Burmese military attempted to withdraw all of the foreign currency reserves, which was clearly like an attempt to take it for themselves. And they have a proven track record of stealing state resources to support themselves, the military. So it was an anti-money laundering, anti-corruption measure. In this case, it was similar in the sense that on a short-term basis, Treasury Department decides we're revoking the credentials because the former government has collapsed and we don't know who the new government is, and so it's on hold. The problem is that makes sense on August 15th, but does it make sense on September 15th, a month later, when it is clear that the de facto sovereignty of the country has changed and there is a new de facto sovereign, even if you're not going to recognize the government as legitimate? That's where questions start to come into play. And Dr. Marebi mentioned the Federal Reserve Act, Article 25B. This is the Federal Reserve Act provision that governs the recognition of a representative of a central bank. And if you read it very carefully, it doesn't say anything about the government. What it says is the Secretary of State is supposed to recognize an accredited representative of the nation, the country, in this case, Afghanistan, who is then authorized to access the accounts. That can be anybody. It doesn't have to be necessarily a member of the government or the central bank. It could be somebody who's outside the government, or it could be Dr. Marebi. It could be a person who is recognized by the Secretary of State as an accredited representative, who can then appoint people who are accredited to move the money. And that in some ways is the saving grace here. Unlike some countries which think that this whole issue is interlinked with recognizing the government of Afghanistan, it's actually quite possible to give the central bank its credentials without recognizing the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan as the legitimate government.
Thank you very much. That's actually a really powerful point, and I'm wondering how we could follow up on it in Congress. I may be in touch with you about that, John. Okay, so I think that is the questions we had. It's exactly noon, which is when we plan to wrap up. As I said, I put my my email, which is Marcus, Marcus, at QuincyInst, QuincyInst.org. And feel free to contact me or others at Unfreeze Afghanistan if you want to follow up with any of the panelists or have further questions. And thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks so much to our panelists for the time that you've put in. I thought it was a terrific and deeply informed presentation. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Marcus.
Marcus.